February 21st, 1965. Audubon Ballroom, Washington Heights, 2:58 p.m. Malcolm X stood at the podium, about to address 400 people. Thomas Hagan sat in the third row, shotgun hidden under his coat. Two more assassins waited in the wings. The plan was simple: cause a distraction, rush the stage, empty every weapon into Malcolm X, then disappear into the chaos. What nobody knew, what the FBI files would never reveal, is that Bumpy Johnson was in that ballroom, 10 feet behind Hagan, gun already drawn, finger on the trigger. One bullet, one dead assassin. Malcolm lives. But then Malcolm turned, saw Bumpy, saw the gun, saw the choice Bumpy was about to make, and Malcolm shook his head. No, not like this.
What happened in the next 30 seconds changed everything, because Bumpy Johnson had to make an impossible decision: save Malcolm's life or respect his wishes. And what Bumpy chose, what he did in those final moments, haunted him until the day he died.
To understand what happened at the Audubon Ballroom, you need to understand the relationship between Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X. They weren't friends in the traditional sense. They were something deeper, kindred spirits. Two men who understood what it meant to protect Harlem at any cost. They first met in 1954. Malcolm was a young firebrand minister at Temple No. 7 in Harlem. Bumpy was the king of Harlem's underworld. On paper, they had nothing in common. Malcolm preached righteousness. Bumpy lived in the gray. But they shared something more important than ideology. They both loved Harlem. February 1954. A police officer named Michael Haley beat a Muslim brother nearly to death outside the temple. The NYPD refused to press charges.
Malcolm organized a protest. 300 Muslims marched to the 28th precinct. Silent, disciplined, waiting for justice.
Bumpy heard about it, walked down to the precinct, found Malcolm standing in front, arms crossed, face calm. "You're Malcolm, right? From the temple?" "I am. And you're Bumpy Johnson. Guilty as charged." Bumpy looked at the 300 men standing behind Malcolm. "You planning to go inside?" "We're planning to stay here until they release our brother and charge that officer. That's a long stand. Then we'll stand long." Bumpy smiled. "You got courage. I respect that." He turned to leave, then stopped. "You need anything, you let me know. Food, water, legal help. Harlem takes care of Harlem." "We don't need help from gangsters," one of Malcolm's men said, but Malcolm held up his hand. "We appreciate the offer, Brother Johnson."
"If we need it, we'll call." 3 hours later, the NYPD released the brother. No charges against the officer. But Malcolm had made his point, and Bumpy had watched the entire thing from across the street.
Over the next 11 years, Bumpy and Malcolm developed an unusual relationship. They didn't socialize. Malcolm wouldn't set foot in Bumpy's establishments. Bumpy never attended mosque. But when Malcolm needed protection for events, Bumpy's men provided it quietly. When Bumpy needed someone to talk sense into young men heading down the wrong path, Malcolm did it. They operated in different worlds, but with the same purpose: protect the community. 1964. Everything changed. Malcolm left the Nation of Islam. Elijah Muhammad, the leader Malcolm had served for 12 years, turned on him, called him a traitor, a hypocrite. Worse, Malcolm started receiving death threats, not from the police, not from white supremacists,
From his own former brothers in the nation. By early 1965, Malcolm knew they were coming for him. His house was firebombed on February 14th. His family barely escaped. Malcolm moved them to a hotel, started sleeping with a rifle next to his bed.
February 15th, 1965. Malcolm called Bumpy. It was the first time he'd ever initiated contact. "Brother Johnson, I need to talk." They met at Wells Restaurant, 2 a.m. The place was empty except for the night staff. Malcolm looked exhausted, thinner than Bumpy remembered. "They're going to kill me," Malcolm said quietly. "Who?" "The nation, Elijah's people, maybe worse." Bumpy leaned forward. "You want protection? I can have 20 men on you 24/7. "No, that's not why I called." "Then why?" Malcolm looked at him. "Because when it happens, and it will happen, I don't want you to retaliate." Bumpy sat back. "You're asking me to do nothing? I'm asking you to let me die with dignity. If they come for me, they come."
But I don't want a war in Harlem. I don't want Muslim brothers killing each other in the streets. I don't want the movement destroyed because of me.
"Malcolm, promise me, Bumpy, when I die, you let it go." Bumpy stared at him for a long time. "I can't promise that. Then I'm asking you as a favor. For Harlem." The silence stretched. Finally, Bumpy nodded. "I'll think about it. That's all I ask." They shook hands. Malcolm left. Bumpy sat there for another hour, staring at his coffee, thinking about a man who knew he was going to die and was more worried about protecting others than saving himself. February 20th, 1965. Bumpy's intelligence network was the best in Harlem. He had informants everywhere. Policy runners, numbers collectors, street watchers, people who saw things, heard things, reported back.
One of them, a young brother named Jerome, worked as a cleaner at the Nation of Islam's Mosque No. 7.
Jerome called Bumpy at 11 p.m. "Boss, I heard something." "Talk." "There's a hit planned. Tomorrow. Audubon Ballroom. Malcolm speaking at 3 p.m. "You sure?" "I heard 3 brothers talking. Thomas Hagan, Norman Butler, and Thomas Johnson. They're the shooters." Bumpy's jaw tightened. "You got details?" "Hagan's sitting in the audience, shotgun under his coat. Butler and Johnson are in the wings. The plan is to cause a distraction, rush the stage, and empty everything into Malcolm." "Security?" "Malcolm refused heavy security, doesn't want to look scared. There'll be some brothers watching, but not enough." Bumpy thanked Jerome, hung up, sat in his office staring at the phone. Malcolm had asked him not to interfere.
Had asked him to let it happen. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't the kind of man who stood by while someone he respected got murdered. He made a decision. He'd go to the Audubon Ballroom. He'd position himself where he could see Thomas Hagan, and if Hagan made a move, Bumpy would stop him. Malcolm could be mad about it later. At least he'd be alive. February 21st, 1965, 2:30 p.m. Bumpy Johnson walked into the Audubon Ballroom wearing a long coat and a fedora pulled low. He blended into the crowd, 400 people, families, children, community members excited to hear Malcolm speak. Bumpy found a position in the back, eyes scanning, looking for Hagan. 2:45 p.m. He spotted him, 3rd row, right side, bulge under his coat, too big to be a pistol, shotgun. Bumpy moved closer, found a spot 10 feet directly behind Hagan, reached into his coat, felt the cold steel of his .45. He'd done this 1,000 times, waited in crowds, watched targets, made decisions in split seconds about who lived and who died.
2:52 p.m. Malcolm X walked onto the stage. The crowd erupted in applause. Malcolm smiled, raised his hand. "Assalamu alaikum." "Wa alaikum salam," the crowd responded. Malcolm began to speak. "Brothers and sisters, we are living in a time of great change." Bumpy's eyes never left Hagan, watched his hands, watched his body language, waiting for the tell, the moment before action. 2:57 p.m. Norman Butler and Thomas Johnson took positions on opposite sides of the ballroom, near the stage, exits covered. Bumpy saw them, recognized Butler from Jerome's description. This was it. The hit was happening. Now. 2:58 p.m. A commotion in the back. "Get your hand out of my pocket!" A man shouting. People turning. The distraction.
Bumpy's hand closed around his gun. Hagan stood up, coat opening, shotgun emerging. Bumpy pulled his weapon, finger on the trigger, aimed at the back of Hagan's head. One shot, that's all it would take. But then, as if he sensed it, Malcolm X looked directly at Bumpy. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Malcolm saw the gun, saw Bumpy's intention, and Malcolm shook his head, slowly, deliberately. No. Bumpy froze. Malcolm's lips moved. No sound, but Bumpy could read them. "Let me go." At that exact moment, a little girl slipped off her father's lap, maybe 6 years old. Brown dress, pigtails. She climbed onto a chair, leaned into the aisle, directly in Bumpy's line of fire. If Bumpy pulled the trigger now, the bullet would go through her before it reached Hagan. Bumpy's eyes dropped to the child.
Looked back up at Malcolm. Malcolm mouthed 3 more words. I die standing. Time stopped. Bumpy Johnson, the man who'd killed dozens, who'd never hesitated when violence was necessary, stood frozen, gun in hand, watching his friend about to be murdered.
The shotgun blast echoed through the ballroom. Malcolm X stumbled backward. His hands went to his chest, blood spreading. Hagan dropped the shotgun, pulled a pistol, kept firing. Butler and Johnson rushed the stage from both sides. More shots. Pop, pop, pop. The crowd screamed, people diving under chairs, mothers covering children. Chaos everywhere. Malcolm collapsed, 16 bullet wounds. His body jerked with each impact, then went still. Bumpy stood there, gun still in his hand, watching. The little girl who'd been in his line of fire was now under her father's body, safe, alive. Hagan turned, started moving toward the exit. He had maybe 30 seconds before the crowd realized what happened and turned on him.
30 seconds to escape into the street, disappear, get away with murder.
Bumpy Johnson holstered his gun, not because he couldn't shoot Hagan, because Malcolm had asked him not to, had asked him to let it happen without retaliation. But Hagan making it out of that ballroom alive? Malcolm hadn't asked for that. Bumpy moved, not toward Hagan, toward the door, the only exit Hagan could use. He got there first, positioned himself, waited. Hagan pushed through the panicking crowd, eyes wild, gun still at his hand. He saw the door, freedom. He was going to make it. Then he saw Bumpy Johnson standing in front of it. Hagan stopped. Recognition flashed across his face. He raised his gun. Bumpy didn't move, just looked at him, cold, empty. You're not leaving, Bumpy said quietly.
Behind Hagan, the crowd realized what had happened. Realized Malcolm was dead. Realized this man holding a gun was the killer.
They turned on him like a wave. 20 men, 30, more. Fists, chairs, rage. Hagan tried to fight through them, tried to reach the door, but Bumpy stood there, blocking it, making sure Hagan went nowhere. The beating was brutal. Hagan's legs snapped, his face split open, blood everywhere. Stop, someone yelled. We need him alive. The police arrived, pulled Hagan out of the crowd. He was barely conscious, broken, destroyed, but alive. As they dragged him past Bumpy, Hagan looked up, blood running down his face. You could have stopped this, Hagan whispered. You were right there. Bumpy leaned down. I know. Why didn't you? Because he asked me not to. Bumpy straightened. But I made sure you'd pay for it.
Every day for the rest of your life, you'll remember that you almost escaped, and I'm the reason you didn't. The police hauled Thomas Hagan away. Bumpy Johnson stood at that door watching. Around him, the Audubon Ballroom had become a crime scene. Malcolm X's body lay on the stage, covered with a white sheet, already soaked through with blood. His wife, Betty Shabazz, was screaming. His children were crying. 400 people were in shock, and Bumpy Johnson felt something he'd rarely felt in 40 years of life. Regret. Not for what he'd done, for what he hadn't done. He'd had the shot. Clear line. 1 bullet. Malcolm would still be alive. But Malcolm had asked him to stand down, and Bumpy had honored that request. The question that would haunt him for the next 3 years: had he made the right choice? February 21st, 1965, 4:37 p.m. Bumpy walked out of the Audubon Ballroom. His lieutenant, Willie Thompson, was waiting on the street. Boss, I heard. Is it true? Malcolm's dead. Willie's face fell. What do we do? Nothing. Nothing? Boss, we can find out who ordered the hit. We can... Malcolm asked me not to retaliate. I gave him my word.
You gave your word before he died. That don't count now. Bumpy turned on him. It counts more now. A man's last wish? That's sacred. Willie nodded slowly. What about Hagan? He'll spend the rest of his life in prison. That's enough. But it wasn't enough. Not for Bumpy. Not for Harlem. The entire neighborhood was in mourning. Malcolm X wasn't just a minister. He was hope.
He was the voice that told young black men they were worth something, that they didn't have to accept second-class citizenship, that they could stand up and demand respect.
And someone had silenced that voice forever. February 22nd, 1965. 6 a.m. Bumpy sat in his apartment on Edgecombe Avenue. He hadn't slept, just sat in his chair, replaying the moment. The look on Malcolm's face, the shake of his head. Let me go. His wife, Mamie, came out of the bedroom. Ellsworth, you need to rest. I can't. You did what he asked. I let him die, Mamie. No, you honored his wishes. There's a difference. Bumpy looked at her. Is there? Mamie sat next to him. Malcolm knew what he was choosing. He knew the cost. And he chose to die rather than start a war in Harlem. You respected that. That's not betrayal. That's loyalty. It feels like betrayal. Because you're a man who saves people.
But sometimes you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. The phone rang. Bumpy didn't move. Mamie answered. It's for you.
Bumpy took it. Johnson? Mr. Johnson, this is Detective Raymond Phillips, NYPD. I know who you are, Ray. We need to talk about yesterday. Nothing to talk about. I think there is. We have witnesses saying you were at the Audubon Ballroom, standing right behind Thomas Hagan before the shooting. Bumpy's jaw tightened. So you had a gun. You had a clear shot. Why didn't you stop him? Ask Malcolm X. Oh wait, you can't. Bumpy hung up. Mamie looked at him. The police know. They know I was there. They don't know why I didn't act, and they never will. February 27th, 1965. Malcolm X's funeral. 1,500 people at the Faith Temple Church of God. Another 15,000 outside. Bumpy Johnson stood in the back, not in the main gathering.
He didn't feel like he'd earned the right to mourn publicly. Actor Ozzie Davis gave the eulogy. Malcolm was our manhood, our living black manhood, and in honoring him, we honor the best in ourselves.
Bumpy's throat tightened. After the funeral, a young man approached him. Couldn't have been more than 19. Mr. Johnson? Bumpy turned. Yeah. My name's Robert. I was in the Audubon Ballroom. I saw you. Bumpy went still. What did you see? I saw you behind Hagan. I saw your gun. I saw Malcolm look at you. Robert's eyes filled with tears. Why didn't you save him? Bumpy stared at this kid, this heartbroken young brother who'd just lost his hero. Because he asked me not to. That don't make sense. It doesn't have to make sense to you. It only had to make sense to him. But he's dead. Yeah, Bumpy said quietly. He is. Robert wiped his eyes. Was it worth it? Honoring his wishes? I don't know yet.
Ask me in 10 years. Robert walked away. Bumpy stood there watching Malcolm's casket being loaded into the hearse, wondering if he'd ever have an answer to that question. March 1965. The streets were talking. 3 names. Thomas Hagan, Norman Butler, Thomas Johnson. The 3 assassins. Hagan was in custody, hospitalized but alive. Butler and Johnson were arrested days after the shooting. All 3 claimed to be acting alone. Nobody believed them. The FBI knew it was a Nation of Islam hit. Everyone in Harlem knew it. But proving who ordered it was different. Bumpy started asking questions, not to retaliate, just to understand. Who made the call? Who gave the order? Who decided Malcolm X had to die? His network came back with answers. March 12, 1965. Willie Thompson walked into Bumpy's office at Wells Restaurant.
Boss, I got names. I told you. I know, no retaliation, but you asked who ordered it.
I got that. Bumpy leaned back. Talk.
It goes higher than we thought. Elijah Muhammad gave the approval, but the logistics came from the nation's enforcement wing. Captain Joseph, Minister Louis X, maybe others. Louis? Bumpy knew him. Louis X, who would later change his name to Louis Farrakhan, was one of Malcolm's former students. Yeah, word is he was calling Malcolm a traitor in every sermon for months, priming the pump. Bumpy processed this. And after Malcolm died? Louis took over Temple No. 7, Malcolm's Semple. Convenient. Willie nodded. What do you want to do? Nothing. Boss. I said nothing, Willie. Malcolm made his choice. We honor it. But honoring Malcolm's choice didn't mean Bumpy forgot. It meant he waited.
And Bumpy Johnson was very good at waiting. June 1965. Thomas Hagan, Norman Butler, and Thomas Johnson went to trial. The prosecution's case was solid. Eyewitnesses, physical evidence, Hagan's injuries from the crowd beating him. But something was wrong. Butler and Johnson both had alibis. Multiple witnesses placed them elsewhere at the time of the shooting, yet they were convicted anyway. March 1966. All three men sentenced to life in prison. Bumpy watched the trial, said nothing, did nothing. But he knew something the prosecutors didn't. Butler and Johnson were innocent. They were Nation of Islam members, yes, but they weren't at the Audubon Ballroom that day. The real shooters, the two who'd been in the wings with weapons, had escaped in the chaos, and the NYPD either didn't know or didn't care. Two men went to prison for a crime they didn't commit. The system needed someone to blame, so it blamed the first Muslim brothers it could find.
Bumpy considered coming forward, testifying, telling the court what he'd seen. But that would mean admitting he'd been there, armed, with the ability to stop it. And it would raise questions he couldn't answer without betraying Malcolm's last request. So Bumpy stayed silent, and two innocent men rotted in prison. 1966, 1967, 1968. 3 years passed. Bumpy threw himself into work, the numbers racket, policy banks, protecting Harlem from outside threats. But Malcolm's death haunted him. Every time he walked past the Audubon Ballroom, he saw it. Every February 21st, he couldn't sleep. The what-ifs consumed him. What if he'd ignored Malcolm's wishes? What if he'd taken the shot anyway? What if the little girl hadn't been in the way? What if Malcolm was still alive? July 7th, 1968. Bumpy Johnson was having breakfast at Wells' restaurant, same place where he and Malcolm had their last conversation. He felt chest pains, sharp, radiating down his left arm. Heart attack. He collapsed. Died before the ambulance arrived. He was 62 years old. At his funeral, thousands came. Politicians, musicians, community leaders. And standing in the back, just like Bumpy had stood at Malcolm's funeral, was a man who'd been in prison for 3 years, paroled early for good behavior. Thomas Hagan. He shouldn't have been there. Technically, his parole conditions forbid him from being around former associates, but Hagan had to come, had to pay respects to the man who'd made sure he didn't escape. After the funeral, Hagan approached Mamie Johnson. Mrs. Johnson. Mamie turned, recognized him immediately. Her face hardened. "You have a lot of nerve being here." "I know, but I needed to say something." "What could you possibly say?" Hagan looked down. "Your husband could have killed me that day." He had the shot. I saw him. Malcolm saw him. He honored Malcolm's wishes. I know, but after I shot Malcolm, when I was trying to escape, Bumpy blocked the door, made sure I didn't get away, made sure I'd pay for what I did. Hagan's voice cracked. I've spent 3 years in prison thinking about that, about how Bumpy saved Malcolm's killer, but made sure I'd face justice. That takes a different kind of strength. Mamie stared at him. What's your point?
My point is, your husband was a better man than me, better than most men, and I'm sorry I took away his friend. Mamie's eyes filled with tears. Get out of here. Hagan nodded, started to leave, then stopped. One more thing. The two men in prison with me, Butler and Johnson, they weren't there that day. They didn't shoot Malcolm. What? I've told the police. I've told lawyers. Nobody listens, but they're innocent.
And if Bumpy had lived, I think he would have figured out a way to get them out. Hagan walked away. Mamie stood there, processing. Her husband had known. He'd known there were two innocent men in prison, and he'd said nothing to protect Malcolm's dying wish.
1977, 9 years after Bumpy's death, Thomas Hagan gave a detailed confession, admitted he shot Malcolm X, named his real accomplices, not Butler or Johnson, two other men who'd escaped and were never charged. The legal system ignored him. Butler and Johnson remained in prison. 2020, 55 years after Malcolm's death, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office reopened the case, investigated, discovered what Bumpy had known in 1965. Norman Butler and Thomas Johnson were innocent. They were exonerated, released, given settlements, but they'd already served 20 years in prison for a crime they didn't commit.
When asked why it took so long, prosecutors said the truth had been buried under decades of misinformation. But the truth wasn't buried. Bumpy Johnson knew it, Thomas Hagan knew it, the FBI probably knew it. They just chose not to act. Because the truth was complicated, and complicated truths don't make for good headlines.
February 21st, 1965, the day Malcolm X was assassinated. The day Bumpy Johnson made the hardest decision of his life. Let his friend die to honor his wishes, or save him and betray his trust. Bumpy chose honor. He let Malcolm die standing, as Malcolm wanted. But Bumpy made sure the killer paid. Made sure Hagan never escaped. Made sure he'd spend the rest of his life knowing he'd been caught. That's the part history forgot. Bumpy Johnson didn't save Malcolm X, but he avenged him in the only way Malcolm would have accepted. Not with violence, not with retaliation, with justice. Cold, calculated, inescapable. Thomas Hagan had 30 seconds to escape. Bumpy Johnson made sure he never made it to the door.
And for the next 3 years, until Bumpy died, he carried the weight of that decision. The knowledge that he could have changed history, could have saved one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, but he chose loyalty over intervention, respect over rescue.
Was it the right choice? Malcolm thought so. He died believing Bumpy had honored his wishes. Bumpy died wondering if he should have ignored them. And 60 years later, we're still asking the same question. When someone you love asks you to let them go, do you honor that? Or do you fight for them anyway? Bumpy Johnson answered that question on February 21st, 1965, standing 10 feet behind a killer, gun in hand, watching his friend die, choosing loyalty. If this story of impossible choices, of honor over outcome, moved you, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if you understand that sometimes the hardest thing to do is nothing. Share this with someone who's ever had to choose between respecting someone's wishes and saving their life. What would you have done in Bumpy's position? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, the strongest men aren't always the ones who act. Sometimes they're the ones who have the strength to stand still when everything in them is screaming to move.